Have you ever noticed how many times in the Christmas stories we hear the phrase, "Don't be afraid"? I think it slips past our ears because we don't think of the Christmas story as being scary. These are quaint stories. They're happy stories. They're comforting stories. We imagine telling them in the warm glow of a fireplace by a Christmas tree. But time after time after time, angels keep showing up to say the same thing. All of our main characters in the Christmas stories, from Zechariah to Mary, from Joseph to the shepherds, all get told by the angels that they don't need to be afraid. It's a very weird thing to us. After all, really, we've heard these stories over and over. We know how it goes. What is there to be afraid of? Of course, those shepherds from long ago, if they could look at our lives, they might wonder a similar thing about us. What do we have to be afraid of? Current pandemic notwithstanding, didn't the Harvard professor Steven Pinker remind us that the world of the 21st century is safer for the vast majority of us than the world in all of its previous eras? With all of the resources and the conveniences and the technology available to us, what is there to be afraid of? Well, we've found plenty, haven't we? We're afraid of a lot of things. Sharks, thunder, well, maybe lightning, getting needles, flying, closed in or crowded spaces, germs, public speaking. Some of us are afraid of feeling trapped in a prison of mind or body, or schedule, or circumstance. Some of us are afraid of pain. Some of us are afraid of failing. Some of us are afraid of not being in control. Some of us are afraid of what people will think of us. Some of us are afraid of being rejected or abandoned. Might be that we are afraid we're not good enough, that we're not worthy of love. We have fears about being alone, fears about losing a loved one or a relationship ending, anxieties about health or employment, concern for the future of one's children or grandchildren, dread about the return of mental or physical illness, apprehension for the environment and the world we will leave behind. We have fears of addiction or of addiction-fed behavior. We might be afraid of conflict turning to violence. This week, students and teachers in our local high school were afraid that they wouldn't be safe because of a social media post warning of, or perhaps threatening, a school shooting. And add to that all of the ways that living in a pandemic leads and adds to the uncertainty of what could or should or will happen next. The presence of COVID-19 and its variants have heightened anxiety and the fear level all around us. In the last few days, provinces across the country have once again ordered restrictions that they thought they would never do, due to the fear of how transmissible and dangerous Omicron may turn out to be. And there is this pervasive anxiety about what's going to come next, whether in a more universal sense related to public health or the economy, or individually about how we're going to talk to our neighbors and our family members with whom we are just not seeing eye to eye at the moment, if we ever did. From a scientific perspective, fear is a primary emotion processed in the amygdala. the part of the brain that detects threats and signals the body to produce the stress hormones that make us ready to fight or flight. It's largely involuntary, and while it's necessary for our survival, it's unpleasant, except maybe under controlled circumstances like on a roller coaster. This fear response that we have is largely unhelpful for many of our modern fears. We might feel our chests tighten when we hear a notification on our phone. We might experience butterflies in our stomach before we open the door on the first day of a new job. And our brain gives us that dose of adrenaline even when things are not likely to physically harm us at all. It also explains why some of our worst actions and decisions are motivated by fear. Fear has this way of leading you to misperceive both threats and opportunities, of prompting impulse and sometimes impulsive and irrational behavior, of narrowing your vision so that it's difficult to see possibilities. Fear paralyzes, making trusting and the confident action that trust makes possible very difficult, if not impossible. Fear makes you run away, it makes you withdraw. Even indifference is a byproduct of fear. We choose not to care because we're afraid of something. So it's really hard to be wise and prudent and compassionate when we are afraid. Perhaps you recognize some of that in yourself or in the world around you right now. I know that I do. Now, we human beings, have a natural way to manage our hyperactive amygdala. Here's some more big words. It's a neuropeptide called oxytocin, which is sometimes called the love molecule. Oxytocin is produced in the brain in response to things like eye contact and touch, especially between loved ones. The feeling it creates, as you well know, is pretty pleasurable. In fact, life might be unbearable without it. There is evidence that an oxytocin deficit is one reason for the increase in depression during this recent pandemic. With our lockdowns and our social distancing and divisions over what measures are actually in the best interests of public health, oxytocin has been missing. And oxytocin reduces our anxiety, it reduces our stress by kind of blocking out the response to the amygdala and to the messages coming at it. It's kind of like a shield for that part of your brain. So in simple terms, if you have loving contact with other people, the outside world seems less scary and threatening to you. To quote the author from Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life, Arthur Brooks, the real issue isn't that there are too many things to be afraid of. The real issue isn't about the threats that are facing us. The real issue is that we have too little love in our lives to protect us from our fears. And stop. What did that child say in the video we watched earlier? How can you deal with your fear? Well, you have to build a bridge, and then you walk over it. Or as a biblical writer said centuries ago in 1 John chapter 4, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. This is ancient, ancient wisdom. One of the Bible words for love is agape. And if you translate that literally into English, it kind of means to incline yourself towards someone, to invest in them, to care. Phobos, the Greek word for fear, literally sort of means leaning away from, avoiding, removing ourselves from others. You know that instinct. Something scary over there, I'm going over there. The ancient words for fear and love had within them their relationship to one another. And Jesus' story in the Bible is from the very beginning a juxtaposition of fear and love. Luke's story of Jesus' birth begins with this decree from the emperor. Let's be clear who's in charge here. You will all need to be counted. You need to be registered to pay your taxes to meet my needs, or else. Be afraid. Do what you're told. Jesus was born into a time when people lived scared. And in this story, where people are afraid and they are acting out of their fear, comes another decree. A decree offered to shepherds, ones who mattered so little that they might not even be worth counting for the emperor. And as soon as the decree begins, we know that something is different here. Don't be afraid. There is no punishment here. There is no or else here. You don't have to be afraid. Now, sure, that might feel just as scary at first, because that could turn the world as you know it upside down. We're supposed to feel afraid. That's how we act. That's how we know what we're doing. We're scared. But this is a story about love being born, which, it turns out, is the best way to cast out fear. The fear that is everywhere. That's the good news for you, say the angels. With love, you don't have to be as afraid. And what do you know? The shepherds seem to believe it. Despite the fact that this is a weird, frightening thing happening, they believe that they don't have to be afraid. They believe it enough that they don't let their fear keep them in their places, hidden out on the hills, to remain withdrawn from the world, but instead they move. They move through their fear towards something new, towards other people, other strangers no less, to pierce that shield of indifference that allows them to be participants in the new story. In the face of the angel's decree, the shepherds choose not to be afraid, but instead to care and to invest themselves in whatever this thing is that has come to pass. It's not that there isn't plenty to be afraid of, then or now. But part of the message of Christmas is that there are other ways, other things other than flight or fight to respond to the fear that is all around us and within us. Instead of reacting out of our fear, we could be creative and compassionate and clever and make much better decisions together. We could be prudent and trusting and wise if we were to give fear a little less space in our hearts and lives. What we might discover is that there is then a whole lot more room for all of those other things. And, say the angels, if you can invest yourself in this child and his story, he will guide you, he will teach you about how to live in the ways of love and truly abundant living, so that you don't have to live afraid all the time. It's good news. It really is. Don't be afraid. Amen.